My stepmother tried to erase my mother's memory from our house, so I erased her from our lives. I was 17 when everything started falling apart, though I didn't realize it at the time. My mom had been gone for 3 years by then. Cancer took her when I was 14, and my dad remarried about 18 months later. Looking back, I think he was just desperately trying to fill the void she left behind, but he ended up bringing a woman into our home who saw my mother's memory as competition rather than something to be respected. The woman my father married seemed nice enough at first, always smiling and asking about my day, bringing me little gifts and trying to bond over movies we both liked. She had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the room when she talked to you, which I guess is why my dad fell for her so quickly. But there were little things that bothered me from the beginning, small comments about how we needed to move forward as a family, how it wasn't healthy to dwell on the past, how my mother would have wanted us to be happy. The first real incident happened about 6 months after they got married. I came home from school to find that the family photo of my mom, dad, and me that had always sat on the mantel in our living room was gone. When I asked about it, my stepmother said she had just moved it to give the room a fresh look, and that she'd put it somewhere safe. She showed me where she'd placed it, tucked away in a corner of the guest bedroom where no one ever went, like my mother was some embarrassing secret we needed to hide. I was upset, but I didn't want to cause drama, so I just quietly moved the photo back to its original spot the next day. When I got home from school, it was gone again. This time when I confronted her about it, she sat me down and explained that it was hard for her to feel like she belonged in our family when reminders of my father's previous marriage were everywhere. She said she understood how important my mother was to me, but that we needed to make space for new memories too. That conversation should have been a red flag, but I was just a kid dealing with grief and trying to navigate this new family dynamic. I didn't know how to articulate why her request felt so wrong, why it made my stomach twist into knots. I just knew that seeing my mother's face every day when I walked into our living room made me feel like she was still with us somehow, and without that photo, the house felt empty and cold. Over the next few months, more things started disappearing. The coffee mug with the chip on the handle that my mom used every morning vanished from the kitchen cabinet. The throw pillow she'd embroidered with our family dog's name disappeared from the couch. Her favorite cookbook, the one with all the handwritten notes in the margins, was nowhere to be found when I went looking for her chocolate chip cookie recipe. Each time I noticed something missing, my stepmother had a reasonable explanation. The mug was old and didn't match the new dishes she'd bought. The pillow was worn out and needed to be replaced. The cookbook had been damaged by a spill and had to be thrown away. She always apologized for not asking me first, always promised to be more considerate in the future, but the disappearances continued. What really got to me was how my father seemed completely oblivious to what was happening. When I tried to talk to him about it, he'd just say that his wife was trying to make our house feel more like a home for all of us, and that maybe it was time for me to let go of some of the past. He'd remind me that my mother wouldn't want us to be stuck in grief forever, that she'd want us to embrace the new life we were building together. I started taking photos of everything in the house that had belonged to my mother or reminded me of her, creating a digital inventory on my phone. I felt paranoid and crazy doing it, but I needed proof of what was happening. Sure enough, within a few weeks, I had documented the disappearance of a dozen more items, from the wind chimes she'd hung on the back porch to the set of gardening gloves she'd left in the garage. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in late spring. I woke up early and went downstairs to make breakfast, and immediately noticed that something was different about the kitchen. It took me a moment to realize what had changed, but then it hit me like a punch to the gut. The small herb garden my mother had planted in pots on the windowsill was gone. Not just moved, but completely eliminated, replaced with some generic decorative items that looked like they'd come from a home goods store. I lost it. I mean completely lost it. I started crying and screaming, demanding to know where my mother's plants had gone, asking how she could throw away living things that my mom had cared for. My stepmother tried to calm me down, explaining that the herbs were dying anyway and that she thought some nice new decorations would brighten up the space. She said she'd planned to ask me about it, but wanted to surprise me with how much better the kitchen looked. That's when my father came downstairs, drawn by all the commotion. Instead of supporting me or trying to understand why I was so upset, he immediately sided with his wife. He told me I was being dramatic and ungrateful, that she'd been trying to make our home more beautiful and comfortable for everyone. He said I needed to stop living in the past and start appreciating the effort she was putting into our family. I ran upstairs and locked myself in my room, feeling more alone than I had since the day my mother died. I spent the rest of the weekend going through my phone, looking at all the photos I'd taken of my mother's things, realizing just how much had been systematically removed from our home. It wasn't just random spring cleaning or redecorating. It was a deliberate erasure of my mother's presence from the place where she'd lived and loved and raised me. That's when I started planning. I knew I couldn't stop my stepmother from taking my mother's things, but I could make sure that her own belongings weren't safe either. I began small, moving her coffee mug to different cabinets, hiding her favorite magazines, relocating her decorative items to obscure corners of the house. When she asked about these things, I used her own excuses against her, saying I was trying to give the house a fresh look or that I thought her things would be safer in a different location. At first, she seemed to think it was just coincidence or that my father was moving her things around. But as the incidents increased in frequency and boldness, she started to realize what was happening. I could see the frustration building in her eyes, the way she'd search frantically for her reading glasses or her favorite pen, the way she'd interrogate my father about whether he'd seen her things. The real escalation came when I discovered that she'd thrown away my mother's jewelry box, the one that had belonged to my grandmother before her. I'd been looking for it to get a necklace my mother used to wear, and when I couldn't find it anywhere, I confronted my stepmother directly. She admitted that she'd gotten rid of it because it was taking up too much space in the bedroom, and that she'd assumed I wouldn't want such an old, outdated piece of furniture. I was devastated. That jewelry box had been in our family for generations, and inside it had been not just my mother's jewelry, but little mementos and keepsakes that she'd collected over the years. Photos of us together, ticket stubs from movies we'd seen, a pressed flower from her wedding bouquet. All of it was gone, thrown away like garbage, because my stepmother decided it didn't fit her vision of our home. That night, I went into her closet and selected her most expensive dress, the one she'd worn to their wedding. I took it to the garage and used my father's hedge trimmers to cut it into ribbons. Then I carefully placed the pieces back in her closet, arranging them so that she'd find them when she went to get dressed for work the next morning. The screaming started around 7 a.m. I heard her voice echoing through the house, hysterical and furious, demanding to know who had destroyed her dress. My father came pounding on my bedroom door, but I just pretended to be asleep. When he finally gave up and left for work, I could hear my stepmother on the phone, probably calling her sister or her mother, sobbing about how someone had ruined her most precious possession. I felt a dark satisfaction, knowing that she was experiencing just a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But I also knew that this was just the beginning. She declared war on my mother's memory, and I was going to fight back with everything I had. Over the next few weeks, I became more creative and strategic in my campaign. I started replacing her shampoo with hair removal cream, but only using enough to make her hair thinner and more brittle, not enough to cause obvious bald patches. I put clear nail polish on her car keys so they wouldn't work properly in the ignition. I loosened the screws on her favorite chair just enough that it would wobble uncomfortably, but not collapse completely. Each incident on its own seemed like it could be a coincidence or an accident, but together they created a pattern of chaos and frustration that was driving her to the edge. She started accusing my father of sabotaging her things, which led to huge fights between them. She became paranoid and suspicious, checking and rechecking her belongings, installing a lock on her closet door, hiding her valuables in different places around the house. But the real masterstroke came when I figured out her email password. She was one of those people who used the same password for everything, and I'd seen her type it in enough times to memorize it. Once I had access to her accounts, I discovered that she'd been corresponding with an interior designer about completely renovating our house, removing all traces of my mother's influence from the decor and furniture. The emails were shocking in their callousness. She complained about how difficult it was to make the house feel like her own when it was filled with reminders of the previous wife. She described my mother's taste as outdated and depressing, and talked about how excited she was to finally create a space that reflected her own personality and style. She even mentioned that she was planning to suggest that we move to a completely different house, somewhere without so many memories attached to it. I forwarded these emails to my father from her account, making it look like she'd sent them to him by mistake. I also created a fake email address using a variation of her name and used it to send myself threatening messages, making it appear that she was cyberbullying me. I printed out all of these communications and left them where my father would find them, along with a note about how scared and confused I was about receiving these messages. The confrontation that followed was explosive. My father was furious that his wife had been making plans to erase my mother's memory from our home without consulting him. He was even more angry about the fake threatening emails, which he believed were real. My stepmother protested her innocence, but she couldn't explain how the emails had been sent from her account, and her denials only made her look more guilty. Their marriage began to crumble rapidly after that. My father started questioning everything she'd done since moving into our house, and I helpfully pointed out all the things of my mother's that had disappeared over the months. I showed him my photo inventory, explaining how I'd felt like I was losing my mother all over again as her belongings vanished one by one. What I didn't expect was how much my father would blame himself for not noticing what was happening. He was devastated that he'd allowed someone to systematically erase his first wife's memory from their home, and he was furious that he'd dismissed my concerns instead of protecting me. The guilt was eating him alive, and he started drinking more heavily, staying out later after work, avoiding both me and my stepmother. My stepmother, meanwhile, was falling apart. The stress of the constant sabotage, combined with the collapse of her marriage, was taking a visible toll on her health. She lost weight rapidly, developed dark circles under her eyes, and seemed to jump at every sound. She started accusing me directly of being behind everything that was happening, but she couldn't prove anything, and my father was too angry with her to take her seriously. The final blow came when I discovered that she'd been secretly meeting with a lawyer, exploring her options for divorce, and trying to figure out how much of my father's assets she might be entitled to. I found the paperwork in her car and photographed it, then anonymously mailed copies to my father at his office. When he confronted her about it, she broke down completely. She admitted that she'd been planning to leave him, but claimed it was because she felt unwelcome in our home and couldn't handle the constant stress of living with someone who was clearly disturbed. She said she'd tried to be a good stepmother to me, but that I'd made it impossible for her to feel like part of the family. My father asked her to leave that same day. He didn't want to hear her explanations or excuses, he just wanted her gone. She packed her bags and moved in with her sister, and within a month, she'd filed for divorce. The whole process was messy and bitter, with accusations flying back and forth, but my father's lawyer was better than hers, and she didn't end up with much. What surprised me was how empty I felt after she was gone. I'd expected to feel triumphant or vindicated, but instead I just felt hollow. The house was quiet again, the way it had been after my mother died, but it didn't feel peaceful. It felt haunted by all the anger and manipulation that had filled it during those months of warfare. My father and I tried to rebuild our relationship, but something had been broken between us that couldn't be easily repaired. He felt guilty about remarrying so quickly and bringing someone into our home who'd hurt me so badly. I felt guilty about the elaborate deception I'd orchestrated, even though I believed she deserved it. We were both carrying secrets and shame that made it hard to look each other in the eye. We started going through storage boxes together, looking for things of my mother's that had been packed away over the years. We found photo albums and letters, pieces of jewelry and clothing, books with her handwriting in the margins. We slowly began to restore some of her presents to our home, but it felt forced and artificial, like we were trying to recreate something that had been organically destroyed. The strangest part was that I sometimes found myself missing my stepmother, not because I'd liked her, but because having an enemy had given me a sense of purpose and direction. Without her to fight against, I had to confront my own grief and anger, and I realized that I'd been using the conflict as a way to avoid dealing with my mother's death. I started having nightmares about the things I'd done, dreams where my mother appeared to me looking disappointed and sad. In these dreams, she'd ask me why I'd chosen revenge over healing, why I'd let hatred consume me instead of honoring her memory with love and forgiveness. I'd wake up feeling sick and ashamed, wondering if I'd betrayed everything she'd taught me about kindness and compassion. The divorce was finalized about 6 months after my stepmother left, and my father threw himself into his work to avoid dealing with the emotional fallout. We lived like strangers in the same house, polite but distant, both of us carrying the weight of what had happened. I finished high school that year and started making plans for college, eager to escape the atmosphere of sadness and regret that had settled over our home. But then something unexpected happened. About a year after my stepmother left, I got a call from her sister. She told me that my former stepmother had been in a car accident and was in the hospital, asking to see me. I was shocked and confused, but something compelled me to go visit her. She looked terrible, thin and pale, with her arm in a cast and bandages on her face. When she saw me, she started crying and apologizing, saying that she knew I'd been behind everything that had happened to her, but that she understood why I'd done it. She admitted that she'd been jealous of my mother's memory and had tried to erase her from our home because she'd felt like she could never measure up to a dead woman. She told me that losing my father and being forced to leave our house had been devastating, but that it had also forced her to confront her own insecurities and flaws. She said she'd been in counseling and had come to realize how cruel and selfish her behavior had been, how much pain she'd caused both me and my father. I didn't know what to say to her. Part of me wanted to feel satisfied that she was finally acknowledging what she'd done, but mostly I just felt sad and tired. I could see that she was genuinely remorseful, but I also knew that her apology couldn't undo the damage that had been done to our family. She asked me to forgive her, not for her sake but for mine. She said she could see the anger and pain in my eyes, and she worried that carrying that hatred would poison my future relationships and happiness. She told me that my mother would have wanted me to find peace, not to spend my life fighting battles that couldn't be won. I left the hospital without giving her an answer, but her words stayed with me. I realized that she was right about one thing. The anger I'd been carrying was hurting me more than it was hurting her. I'd spent so much energy on revenge that I'd forgotten how to grieve properly or how to remember my mother with joy instead of pain. Slowly, I started to let go of the resentment that had been consuming me. I began to see my stepmother not as a villain, but as a flawed human being who'd made terrible choices out of her own pain and insecurity. I didn't forgive her completely, but I stopped actively hating her, and that shift made room for other emotions to surface. My father and I started talking more openly about my mother and about what had happened during those difficult months. He apologized for not protecting me better, for not seeing what was happening right in front of him. I apologized for the deception and manipulation, for choosing revenge over honesty. We both acknowledged that we'd made mistakes, but we also began to understand that we'd been doing the best we could with the tools we had at the time. Eventually, we found a way to honor my mother's memory that felt authentic and healing rather than forced or defensive. We created a small memorial garden in our backyard, planting the same herbs she'd grown in the kitchen window along with flowers she'd loved. We framed some of her favorite photos and displayed them throughout the house, not as shrines, but as natural reminders of the woman who'd been such an important part of our lives. I went away to college the following fall, and the distance helped me gain perspective on everything that had happened. I could see how my grief had twisted into something dark and destructive, but I could also see how that experience had taught me important lessons about standing up for what I believed in and protecting the people I loved. My stepmother and I never spoke again after that day in the hospital, but I heard through her sister that she'd moved to another state and was trying to rebuild her life. I hoped she'd found some peace and had learned from her mistakes, just as I was learning from mine. The whole experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I learned that love and hate are sometimes closer to each other than we want to admit, and that the desire to protect someone's memory can become just as destructive as the desire to erase it. I learned that forgiveness isn't about excusing someone's behavior, but about freeing yourself from the burden of carrying their mistakes. Most importantly, I learned that my mother's true legacy wasn't in the objects she'd left behind or the physical spaces she'd occupied, but in the love and values she'd instilled in me. No one could take that away, no matter how hard they tried, and no amount of revenge could bring it back if I chose to abandon it myself. Looking back now, I can see that both my stepmother and I were fighting the same battle from different sides. She was trying to create a new family identity, and I was trying to preserve an old one. Neither of us understood that love isn't a zero-sum game, that honoring the past doesn't have to mean rejecting the present, and that building something new doesn't require destroying what came before. The house feels different now, lighter somehow, as if the weight of all that anger and pain has finally been lifted. My father has started dating again, more carefully this time, and I've learned to be open to the possibility that love can take many forms and that our family can grow without forgetting where we came from. I still miss my mother every day, but the missing feels clean now, like a scar that's fully healed rather than a wound that's still bleeding. I can think about her without feeling the need to defend her memory or fight battles in her name. I can remember her laughter and her wisdom and her love without the shadow of anger that used to darken those memories. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight within ourselves, and that the greatest victories come not from defeating our enemies, but from choosing to become better people despite what they've done to us. It's a lesson I carry with me every day, and one that I hope will guide me through whatever challenges lie ahead.